Ready?
Interpol are an American rock band from New York City formed in 1997. The band consists of Paul Banks on guitar and lead vocals, Daniel Kessler on guitar and occasional backing vocals, Carlos Dangler on bass and keyboards, and Sam Fogarino on drums. Daniel Kessler, aware that he'd be unhappy if he didn't seriously pursue music, had been seeking other musicians for a while. At an NYU summer program in Paris, Daniel met Paul Banks, a younger student that he heard sang and played guitar. They spoke briefly about music, but Daniel felt they didn't have much in common aesthetically when he found out Paul was mainly into hip-hop. Back in New York, Daniel met drummer Greg Judy, and they started a band. While enrolled in a history course at NYU, Daniel approached a student with a unique sense of style that piqued his interest. This was Carlos D. Based on the way he looked, Daniel asked him if he was a musician, and he was. At the time, though, Carlos had given up music to pursue a future in academics.
I decided I didn't want to do any music anymore. I just wanted to listen to classical music, and I was going to pursue this fantasy of being a philosophy professor. So when I was asked by Daniel to play the bass, because that was the position for hire, I was in a mood of experimentation, having just moved to New York, and I just felt like, yeah, why not?
Carlos was a guitarist first, but he joined the group on bass, using a cheap one Daniel had lying around. This early version of the band started practicing and writing songs. After running into Paul in the East Village, Daniel asked him to attend a rehearsal. At the time, Paul didn't want to be in a band, but when he heard them playing an early version of PDA, he was sold. In these very early days of the band, Daniel would sing, and after a few months, Paul quit the band. He felt Daniel was capable of writing great guitar parts without him, and didn't feel like he was really needed. In order to get him back, Daniel offered to let Paul sing, which obviously worked. At this time, the band was practicing in a small room at Funkadelic Studios. In order to be heard over the drums, Paul would basically shout. This would shape his vocal style with the band. The first time he heard Paul sing, Daniel knew they had something special. After a while, the band started playing shows, but they still didn't have a name. Once they started getting a decent turnout, they had to pick a name so people could follow them. After considering a few names, they eventually settled on Interpol.
The fundamental principle of band names is that they sound cool. That's the most important thing about a band name. The reason why it particularly worked among other names that might have sounded cool at the time is the idea of Interpol as this sort of agency where, it's really more about whatever task force they might have in place or whatever operation they might be doing. It's not so much about like special agent this or that or an individual. It's really more about like this sort of agency that you don't know anything about. It's like a very public thing and you don't know anything about it, and it's not about the individuals that make it up. It's about like this broader mission.
After releasing their first EP, Judy left to focus on other projects. In 2000, Daniel met up with drummer Sam Fogarino, who had already heard about the band pretty early on from a recording engineer. Daniel gave him their second EP, and these tracks impressed Sam more than what he had previously heard. The first time Sam played with the band was described by Daniel as instant magic. While all four band members are great musicians, the sound of Interpol really is a sum of all parts, with many differing influences creating a unique sound. With the addition of Sam, their lineup and sound had been completed. After an EP with Sam and with the backing of Matador Records, who the band signed with in early 2002, Interpol went into Tarkin Studios in Connecticut to record their debut album, Turn On the Bright Lights. Met with critical acclaim, this record is widely seen as the band's crown jewel, receiving a 9.5 from Pitchfork and landing on Rolling Stone's Best Albums of the Decade list and the NME's Greatest Albums of All Time. The album is consistently amazing all the way through, making it hard to pick standout tracks. But two of my favorites are album opener Untitled, a song the band used to start live shows with to set the mood for the rest of the night, and The New, a roller coaster of dynamic shifts that starts like this and ends up like this. After returning to Tarkin Studios, the band released their follow-up to Bright Lights, Antics. Less moody than their debut while still retaining their edge, the band cemented their sound with the same intertwined guitar parts, Carlos's wandering melodic bass lines, and Sam's always fitting, very musical drum parts. Charting in 14 countries and making it to number 15 on the Billboard 200, the album was a commercial success. It was also very well received by critics, an impressive feat after releasing such an impressive debut like Turn On the Bright Lights. It made many Best of the Year lists and, like their debut, landed on NME's Greatest Albums of All Time list. The album spawned multiple top 40 hits in the US and UK, including the track Evil.
But hey, who's on trial?
With this increased popularity, the tour that ensued was much larger and longer than anything the band had done before. When it concluded, they took a few months off to recover from exhaustion.
Well, I remember seeing you in Sunderland, and I bumped into you all individually, and each of you sort of took a couple of minutes to tell me how exhausted you were in your own way, you know.
Zane, come here.
Yeah, exactly. You have no idea.
And
I could just tell you guys were knackered, and did you give yourself a bit of time, you know, off the back of that tour to regroup and have a bit of a life, you know?
Prior to the release of their third record, Our Love to Admire, Interpol were signed to Capitol Records.
And when Matador came along, there was also majors too. It wasn't that we got the opportunity to go to a major now, it's that we chose to switch labels now. We chose to be indie on the first two, and Matador did an amazing job.
This album was the first that they recorded in New York City at Electric Lady Studios, where the band would continue to record for their subsequent releases. While the band retained their signature sound on this release, keys played a larger part in the writing of this album, something that's apparent from the opening track, Pioneer to the Falls.
The soul can wait.
This album reached number 4 on the Billboard 200 and number 2 on the UK Albums Chart, the highest in their career to date. 3 records in, and the band continued to get positive reviews, really demonstrating their talent and commitment to writing music they truly believe in.
As far as like having success being somehow clouding your ability to work or anything like that, or influencing what you do, as long as you have what we have, which is that just kind of pure creative energy together, no, we don't think, if you tried to think about what do people want to hear or what kind of song should we write, then we'd probably get stumped, so we just don't do that. We just write whatever we think sounds cool.
Moving back to Matador Records due to changes at Capitol, Interpol released their self-titled 4th album in September of 2010. While the album still did well, it got the least favorable reviews the band had seen to date. The main complaint being that the band seemed to lack direction, playing into their sound too much without moving it anywhere exciting. While it may have been a decent album for Interpol fans, critics maintained that it probably wouldn't excite any new listeners the same way their previous work might. The self-titled is generally seen as Interpol's weakest effort, and it's possible the band agree, as they have been phasing out his tracks from their live set in recent years. This was also the last album Interpol released before Carlos left the band. Though he played on the record, he quit before the following tour.
So with me, what happens is once a narrative starts to take hold, I gotta jump ship.
Yeah.
And I did that with philosophy, because then I jumped ship onto the Interpol train.
Right.
And then once Interpol's narrative started to get at, well, this is what we do, and this is who we are, and this is the business, and it goes like this, that I construe that as an attack on my autonomy. But I did that. I had to jump that ship.
After the tour, the band decided they needed a break and took a hiatus for a few years. When the band got back together to write their next album, the first without Carlos, Paul picked up the bass and the new songs started to form with the band writing as a trio. The bass on these new tracks was more driving and straightforward, giving an energy to the music demonstrated well by lead single All the Rage Back Home.
She said you don't need time.
Beginning in the summer of 2014, Interpol went on a world tour to support their upcoming album, El Pintor. In September of that year, they released the album to highly favorable reviews, with many noting a clear, new direction and calling it a return to the high level of their early work. The title, meaning the painter in Spanish, is an anagram of Interpol that Paul came up with and thought fitting with the art direction the band was taking for the record. The tour continued into late 2015 before concluding at the Electric Picnic Festival in Ireland. After a break in touring for about a year and a half, the band decided to celebrate the 15th anniversary of Turn On the Bright Lights with a tour playing the whole album straight through. Here's a clip that I took of The New from their show in Queens. The band seemed to really be enjoying themselves, and the crowd knew every word. You could really tell the music, and Bright Lights specifically, meant a lot to everyone there. Interpol have just finished their 6th LP, rumored to be called Marauder, and it will be out at the end of August. To date, Interpol have yet to release a bad or even mediocre record, so this release is definitely one to look out for.